Welcome to Take 5, your 5-minute inspirational message from Evangelical Alliance Ireland. I'm Nick Park, and for several weeks, each day, Monday to Friday, I'm going to be taking us through a different book of the Old Testament and encouraging us to start reading the Old Testament more. So we understand what each book, we're given a quick summary of what each book is about and what are the big things that we need to pick up on so we can really start profiting from reading the Old Testament as Christians. And today, number 2, it's Tuesday, so we're on the second book, and it's the book of Exodus. And Exodus simply means the way out. You know, today, if you fly to Greece, if you want to go to Athens or to one of the Greek islands and you fly into the airport terminal, if you look up and if you can read the Greek alphabet, you'll see signs, and they say Exodus, exit. The way out. And that's what Exodus is. It's the way out. It's the way out of slavery in Egypt, but it's also the way out of our sin problem as well, by following God and following him every footstep, every step of the way. And Exodus talks about the way out for Israel after they had landed into slavery in Egypt. It explains about Moses and the Red Sea, parting of the Red Sea and traveling through the wilderness. And one of the things it did was to bring light out of darkness. And this is a theme that the Old Testament covers again and again and again, obviously preparing the way for the New Testament, bringing light out of darkness. You know, this didn't start with Exodus, it started in Genesis. Whenever God looked over, everything was formless and dark, and God said, "Let there be light." And from that moment forward, those first words that God speaks, "Let there be light," from there on, it's about bringing light out of darkness, bringing the Israelites out of the darkness of slavery in Egypt, and bringing them out of the darkness of their own self-inflicted messes as well. So this is actually paving the way from living in this world where there is a sin problem, and that brings its own darkness, and how God then brings us out of so many different kinds of darkness. And this was something the Israelites needed to know, because as they go through the rest of the Old Testament, you know, they've got to know how do they get out of their own self-inflicted messes whenever they fall into cycles of sin and disobedience and idolatry during the days of the judges. Or in the book of Kings, how do they get out of the mess they've created by appointing kings over themselves? Whenever they sin and they're carried off into exile in Babylon, how do they get out of that darkness back into a place where God wants them to be? And when they're occupied by foreigners, including right up to the Romans occupying the land in the time of Jesus, how does God bring them out of that to something better? So that's one of the huge themes of Exodus that had to prepare the Israelites for something that would always be part of their history. How does God bring them out of darkness? Sometimes that darkness is inflicted upon them by others. Sometimes you find yourself in a mess and it's not your fault. Somebody else did it to you. But sometimes you find yourself in a mess and it's your fault because you made the wrong decisions. But you know what? Whether it's caused by somebody else or whether it's self-inflicted, God still wants to bring you out of darkness and bring you into light. And so that's a huge part of the book of Exodus. But also there's more origin stories for the Israelites to help them understand why things around them were the way they are. So why did they have the law? That's explained in Exodus, where the law came from, where the priesthood came from, and where the idea of being a covenant people. Now that began in Genesis, but God developed it so much more with the covenant he made with Moses in the book of Exodus. And for us as Christians now, that's explained why the Jews had the book of Exodus in their Bible. Why do we read it today as Christians? Because we need to understand the same thing. We need to understand that God is a God who specializes in taking us out of darkness and bringing us into light. And that's what salvation is all about. It's about God bringing us out of darkness and death to light and life. And by reading about God doing that in Exodus, that gives us more faith to know that God has done it and will continue to do it for us today. Also, it's setting up. The whole book of Exodus is really setting up the story for the coming of Jesus. The whole thing with establishing the law and the priesthood and everything else is that was a covenant. But God's got a better covenant for us. And if you don't understand the old covenant that God made with Israel, then you're never really going to appreciate how amazing the new covenant is. That is so much better. And reading the book of Exodus helps us to do that. And so my prayer for you today and in the days ahead is that you would keep dipping into and reading the book of Exodus as well as Genesis. Read the book of Exodus. And as you read the book of Exodus, allow God to show you how he's brought you out of darkness into light. He's bringing you onto a more glorious light. And he's set up for you a better covenant than anything Moses ever experienced. And if you can read the book of Exodus in that way, you will be blessed. And stay blessed. And join us again tomorrow for another Take 5, your 5-minute inspirational message from Evangelical Alliance Ireland.